Hi, I'm Dave Miranda, General Counsel and past President of the New York State Bar Association. Welcome to Miranda Warnings. You have the right to remain listening. This week on Miranda Warnings, we're very pleased to have back T. Andrew Brown, the 124th President of the New York State Bar Association and the founder of Brown and Hutchinson, a law firm in Rochester. Welcome, Andrew. Welcome back.
Thank you, David. It's nice to be back with you.
It's good to have you. We're going to talk today about Muhammad Ali. Andrew recently gave a presentation on Muhammad Ali, considered by many to be the greatest boxer of all time and one of the greatest athletes of all time. Much of your presentation covers what Ali did outside the ring. Tell us just broadly, what makes Ali such an intriguing figure for his work outside the ring?
Yeah, Muhammad Ali was a legend both in his sport and outside of his sport. What makes Muhammad Ali stand out as an athlete is what he did beyond his sport. And I think that's when athletes really shine and remain well known long after their fighting or their game years are behind them. And that's true of Muhammad Ali. He used boxing as a platform to do all these other wonderful things. He was known as a humanitarian, a civil rights leader, an activist, and he was unique in the way that he fought, the way that he boxed, unlike any other boxer before him, and unlike any boxer since. So he changed the fight game, and he also impacted life as we know it today. Race relations, religion, respect for the individual. He limited, for the first time with respect to draftees, he limited the ability of government to mandate who was eligible for the draft and who would go to war. So he did all these significant things outside of the ring, but you really can't talk about Muhammad Ali without talking about his years and career and success within the ring.
Right, and so, you speak in your presentation about the conscientious objector case that Ali took up to the Supreme Court, and I'd like to talk about that in depth, but you also go a little bit into his childhood, how he got into boxing in the first place, and so tell us a little bit about his upbringing as Cassius Clay.
Yeah, and with respect to Muhammad Ali, who many, certainly those old enough, will remember as Cassius Clay. Those who grew up on Grand Avenue in Louisville, Kentucky, will forever know him as Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay was nothing special growing up, didn't stand out as an athlete, didn't stand out as a student, was somewhat of a class clown, shy, which is a surprise to many people who got to know him in his public persona. And then one day, in 1954, he was out on a bicycle with his brother, first bicycle he had ever had. A beautiful brand new red and white bicycle, chrome fenders, the works. And remember, to a kid back then, a bicycle was everything. So he had this bicycle, he's out riding around, he stopped somewhere, went inside, and someone stole his bicycle. Came out furious. This was the most significant thing he owned. And his family was of modest means, so they didn't have the ability to go out and buy another bicycle. Someone told him, go across the street and report it to a police officer. That's what he did. It was an off-duty police officer who happened to also be a trainer and a coach in a boxing club. Downstairs, Muhammad went in, said, somebody stole my bicycle. He was furious, said, I'm gonna whoop the person who stole my bicycle. Classic Muhammad Ali. The trainer said, well, do you know how to fight? Looked at this kid, said, you're kind of scrawny, you know how to fight? Muhammad looked at him and said, well, I don't know how to fight. He said, well, start training here. Started training at the boxing club. That's how Muhammad Ali got interested in boxing, never boxed before. And that was a start. He was 12 years old and a whopping 89 pounds.
Right.
That was the start of Muhammad Ali.
Later in life, he converts to Islam and becomes Muhammad Ali. apparently to the chagrin of his parents, who liked the name Cassius Clay. What was his religious upbringing?
Yeah, to the chagrin of everyone. I mean, Muhammad Ali, remember, if you study his life in full, he was someone who was loved, who was hated, and then loved again. And part of the hated years were when he became a member of the Nation of Islam. He was born and raised in a Christian family. He was even himself very proud of his name, Cassius. If it were not for boxing, we would never know of anybody by the name of Muhammad Ali as a fighter. That just wouldn't have happened. He did not take on that name, Muhammad Ali, until after he won the championship. He beat Sonny Liston. And then I think it was maybe even the very next day, he declared himself a member of the Nation of Islam. And at that point, a lot of people really began to hate him. He was anti-Christian. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, which a lot of people thought of as a black radical movement at the time. And here he was brash talking, compounding all that. So people really began to hate him. And also, David, one of the interesting things is, remember, this is the midst of the civil rights movement. And
Yeah, let's place it in the time period, right? So when he converts and he changes his name, this were 1964, right? He's 22 years old.
He's 22 years old. He had just won the title. He's 22 years old.
He had won the title against Sonny Liston.
Yeah.
This is the day after that. 2 years previously, he won the Olympics gold medal, right? 1960, right? So he is a well-known figure. Now he's a U.S. gold medalist. He's now the boxing champion because he beat Sonny Liston. And the next day he announces, when all eyes are on him, the next day he announces that now he's going to henceforth go by Muhammad Ali.
Exactly. So in context, remember, he started boxing at 12 years old. He went to the Olympics in Rome just 6 years later. In the interim, he won 6 Kentucky Gold Gloves. He won multiple national amateur titles, and everybody loved him. And then he goes on to the Olympics and wins the gold, light heavyweight, all within 6 years. He was big, he was known. And back then, Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, was proud and brash talking and black, unheard of for an athlete. Then all of a sudden becomes a member of the Nation of Islam, anti-Christian, and people start to really hate him. And then one interesting thing is, again, this is in the midst of the civil rights movement. He was despised by many black people, including Martin Luther King and his following, because Muhammad Ali spoke out against integration. He was a segregationist. And he later articulated very well his reasons for that. We can get into that if you want. But it was a significant point in time, and so much happened in that short span of time. Now all of a sudden he was loved by everyone. He was loved by everyone, and then with a quick turn of events, he was despised by people across the country, white, black. And at that point, he was the best known athlete on the planet. And he was only 22 years old.
And it wasn't just that he was changing his religion. He had now come out and become an outspoken person against the war, which also added to, I think, the emotions and the vilification that he received at the time. But obviously, for a young man, he was obviously very thoughtful and sincere in his views. As you indicated, there were some in, as you said, black and white, that were upset with what he was doing.
Yeah, and there were a lot of people who were upset, and there was so much happening at that point in America around race and acceptance of religion, especially anything outside of what was thought of as mainstream Christianity. And Muhammad, as a member of the Nation of Islam, had strong views about going to war and fighting with people that did no harm to him, that he saw no threat from. And he was reluctant to go, and he wouldn't go. But in addition to that, even before getting to his religion, Muhammad failed the test that you took back then to qualify for the military. He scored a 16 out of 99. He had to score 30. So he was
physical
ineligible.
test.
No, the writing test, the
writing test.
writing component. And part of it was because Muhammad was dyslexic, and we can get into the relevance of that too if we have time and if you want to. But Muhammad didn't qualify, but as the war continued, more and more young men wanted to go to war. And so the government lowered the standard, and it reached all the way down to where he was, which was way down. And then he challenged that, and his lawyers challenged that, and that was the beginning of what lasted as a case all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, I want to talk about that case, right? So he challenged it as a conscientious objector because it was against his religious belief to fight in this war.
Correct. He challenged it on that basis. And it's interesting because within the Nation of Islam following, there's a position, or there was back then a position about going to war, but it was more of a spiritual position. It wasn't a physical go to war to fight someone and kill someone. It was very different. It was a matter of preparing for the apocalypse. And
The Holy War,
the
they
Holy
talked
War.
about. They talked about the fact that, he talked about the fact that under his beliefs, that he could be involved in a holy war, not in this war. And that issue, I think, became important when he challenged his draft status.
It did eventually, and see, interestingly, when he declared that he would not go to war and declared that he was a conscientious objector, as typical back then, there was an investigation and there was a hearing. The hearing officer was a retired judge who was weary about the position, but upon hearing the evidence, he found that he did substantiate a basis for being a conscientious objector. And then the Department of Justice appealed that. And they took it to an appeal board, and the appeal board reversed it. And that furthered the need for litigation.
So initially, as is customary, the hearing officer interviewed Muhammad Ali at the time and found that his beliefs were sincere and based upon his religion, and found that it was supported. And then the Justice Department felt otherwise, even though they had this recommendation from the hearing officer, and the appellate court affirmed that.
Yep. And see, interestingly, if you look at Muhammad Ali and his whole career, what was going on back there was not simply a matter of looking at legal principles and facts around them. It was a matter of looking at the times that we were in. Civil rights. Also looking at the fact that Muhammad Ali was this black person, never before seen, out there being outspoken, challenging white authority. That had never happened. This was an opportunity to send a lesson to him and other black people at the time. So there was much more going on. It was also the fact that at that point, he was a declared Muslim. There was animosity towards that. So it wasn't simply a matter of looking at facts, relevant facts and law. It was much bigger than that.
And so he ends up, he loses, the Justice Department wins that appeal to the appellate court. He actually gets drafted and is required to go. And when his name is called, he refuses. He's present, but he refuses to participate, and he gets arrested.
Yeah, he did show up, and his name was called, and he refused to step forward, and declared that I am not going to go to war. I'm not going to fight, and so he became a draft dodger. And then after that, shortly after that, he was convicted in a federal district court for draft evasion. And it was the appeal of that district court case that then went to the Court of Appeals, that then went to the Supreme Court.
And I want to talk because I think the Supreme Court case is, very interesting, and you go through some of the behind the scenes of what happened at the Supreme Court. But I think it's worth talking about. There's like a 4-year period between his conviction and 1971 when the Supreme Court case is, and this is not just like a legal matter that we put to the side. talk about how this affected his life, his career.
Yeah. It had a dramatic impact on his life, his family's life. Remember, boxing, you're at the height of your career in your mid-20s. And Muhammad Ali was in his mid-20s. He's 24, just turned, he was 24 when he was told he was going to be drafted, so just about 25. And he's at the height of his career, and if you go back and look at the films of Muhammad Ali at that time, it's an art form. For the first time, boxing became an art form. You could not take your eyes off a screen if Muhammad Ali was fighting. I remember back at those times, if there was a big fight going on, you made it a point to be home. That was like watching the Super Bowl today. It was that big. And Muhammad, at the time, again, the height of his career, in the heyday of boxing, known around the world, the most popular athlete on the planet, was told that he could not fight anymore. What happened was, after he was convicted, the World Boxing Association stripped him of his title, and then every state in the country refused to honor his boxing license, or wouldn't grant him a boxing license. Shortly after he was convicted, his passport was also taken. So he couldn't fight within the United States, he couldn't fight abroad. That was a troublesome time, and that lasted for about 5 years.
Right.
And in that time, he had no avenues to fight until around 1969, where he petitioned to get a license back. And incidentally, it happened right here in New York State. And he was granted a license, and then began his fighting career again. But the most significant years of his life as a boxer were taken away from him.
He petitioned in New York because the license was taken away because of his conviction. And then he went in and showed how many other boxers had licenses that also had convictions for a variety of...
Hundreds of people who had far worse criminal charges lodged against them and conviction, including Sonny Liston.
Right.
There were hundreds of licenses that were granted in New York State for murderers, rapists, you name it, the most brutal types of crimes you can imagine. Back then, if you wanted to fight, they gave you a license. And here, all of a sudden, Muhammad Ali was told, "Oh no, you can't get a license because the New York Athletic Commission said, well, we think that as a convicted criminal, you're bad for the sport game here in New York," which was ludicrous.
And New York, in its defense, on the petition, did eventually grant him the license.
New York was forced to, because there was a judgment. He went to court, a district court, to challenge the arbitrary decisions of the New York Athletic Commission, and they agreed. They didn't agree with him. They said, well, we're going to uphold the Athletic Commission, but we'll give you the opportunity if you come back with evidence to show that you were treated arbitrarily. And he did. Came back with those hundreds of cases, and including people who were convicted for draft evasion and even assaulting officers in the military. So he was able to get his license and get back on track, and he began fighting again, and then we had some of the most memorable fights after that.
And this was, in 71, his case goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court case, as you laid it out, I think is fascinating. First of all, just the title, right? It's Clay versus U.S. Or, I mean, it would have been U.S. v. Clay. It started, but on appeal, it was Clay versus U.S. Why did they still didn't recognize his name?
A couple of reasons, but the more interesting thing with his name is the spelling of his middle name. Because remember, Muhammad was dyslexic. Always struggled in school, didn't qualify for the draft. If you look at that case, his middle name is spelled wrong, because Muhammad himself spelled his own name wrong. He struggled with these things his entire life. But Clay is how it was filled out. That name, Clay Marcellus Jr., Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. is how it was written on his application.
So it goes up to the Supreme Court. They're good, and the numbers are important, I think, here, because I was just the background on this I thought was fascinating. Thurgood Marshall recuses himself for reasons unknown. So it's an 8-person bench now deciding this.
Correct. And yes, the only black justice on the court, Thurgood Marshall, progressive, liberal-minded judge, who you would have thought perhaps would have been most open to the arguments of Muhammad Ali, recused himself. So it was an 8-member bench to decide the fate of this brash black kid who was doing something that no other black person had ever done. And it is an interesting case, how it came about.
Yeah, so the initial decision, or the initial preliminary private decision of the court, is 5-3 to uphold the conviction.
Correct.
And they give the case to Justice Harlan to write. And he changes his mind while he's writing the decision.
He did, and he was one of the members of the majority to uphold the lower court decision, which would have continued to deny Muhammad Ali conscientious objector status. And then and it's interesting backstory, he assigned it to his law clerk, who was younger, more supportive of the conscientious objector basis of not going to war. And he read literature on Muslim faith and the Nation of Islam, and he was not comfortable with the planned ruling and discussed that with Harlan. Harlan himself became more invested and changed his position and thought, wait a minute, the government didn't prove its case. The initial finding was that Muhammad Ali did qualify for conscientious objector. So he changed his position. And then it became a matter of lobbying within the court, and eventually it was an 8-0 unanimous decision.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about how we got there, because even if Harlan changes, it's still 4-4, which means the underlying conviction is upheld, right?
Exactly.
So
and it would not have been reported. The case would not have been reported.
Right.
And so that's why I say there was some lobbying going on, intensive. And remember the time, the civil rights movement, that what was going on there, this would not have looked good. And if there was going to be a Supreme Court decision upholding that lower court, which would have kept in place the refusal of conscientious objector status, they surely were going to have to back that up. And they struggled with that because earlier on, the Department of Justice never justified why they thought the initial hearing officer was wrong. That hearing officer found to the favor of Muhammad Ali. And eventually the Supreme Court decided the case on a technicality. They didn't have to ultimately even rule as to whether or not Muhammad Ali was a conscientious objector, which a lot of people continue to talk about and believe was the case, but they didn't have to get that far, and they didn't. They actually found that there was evidence that he was a conscientious objector, that he did have the evidence to support that, and that the government didn't. And they did not want to rule that every member of the Nation of Islam had a legitimate basis to not go to war. There would have been outrage across the country. So what they did is found a technical basis to reverse the lower court's finding. And that lower court, that technical basis was essentially that the government didn't offer any basis for its position and argument, so there's no basis for the lower courts to have ruled the way they did.
And the government had one of several that it could have relied on, and the court indicated, we just don't know because they've never indicated. So in this case, they felt that the government did not meet its burden on this particular case, right? So it only applied to Ali. But I mean, I just thought it was fascinating that they started with a 5-3 to uphold, and then they end up with an 8-0 per curiam to reverse.
But you know what, David, what's interesting is, again, back then, the government could go into court and win cases just because it was the government, especially against a poor black kid who everybody had begun to hate and they could make an example of. No one questioned the Department of Justice along that case until you have this Tom Cretton Maker, I think was his name, who was a law clerk for Justice Harlan, and then convincing Justice Harlan, who then convinced the rest of his associate justices. It really is a remarkable case. If you look at it and study it and get behind the curtain of the Supreme Court wall, how this case came about and how they eventually went from a vote to uphold to an 8-0 unanimous decision to reverse. Right.
And so now it's 1971, and he's vindicated. He's now, any prohibition on him fighting is lifted, and he goes back at it. And I think for some of the most historic, memorable fights, the fights against Joe Frazier, all happened after this period.
Yeah, it was an interesting whirlwind of a time. And again, remember, Muhammad was not at his best at that point.
So now we're 71. How old is he now?
He was born in 42.
Okay, so he was 29.
He started fighting again when he was 29, close to 30. So those years were important years. And then he continued to fight into his 30s. But again, his prime was behind him. His boxing style began to change. But still, he has some of the biggest fights of his day. One of the first ones.
And he adapted, though, right? He adapted his boxing style, right? He wasn't the peppering, speedy. He was the rope-a-dope.
Yeah.
Right? More.
The rope-a-dope. See, when we talk about Muhammad Ali, we incorporate this whole lexicon around this one figure. So many incredible phrases that people would know from years ago. Which are still just as memorable.
Well, he was a showman, too. I mean, in addition to being a great athlete, he had a sense of branding and entertainment.
He did, remarkably so. Muhammad knew as soon as he started fighting that to make money, people had to be in the arena. And Muhammad participated in that because back then in the fight game, the fighter would take a part of the draw, part of the door. So the more people that came in, the bigger his paycheck. So he began to do things to draw people in, which is really a fascinating part of Muhammad Ali's life and career. And then by the time he got his license back to begin to fight, and the Supreme Court made its ruling, one of the biggest fights was the Joe Frazier fight, which many people will remember to this day. That was a time that boxers didn't make a lot of money. Boxers were thought of a certain way. And now all of a sudden you have two black athletes, guaranteed $2.5 million apiece. Unheard of at that time. And it ended up being referred to as the fight of the century, and it lived up to the name. Both fighters ended up in the hospital, almost killed each other. Still one of the most memorable fights in boxing legend. And that was one of the fights that people look back at and began to question whether Muhammad suffered too much physically from the pounding. And sadly, you mentioned David rope-a-dope. That is something that began later in his career. You never saw that with Muhammad when he was in his prime or early. Muhammad had a unique boxing style. He did not learn the techniques of bobbing and weaving and ducking punches. He would lean back from them. Unheard of. No one did that. And he would also throw his punches off time. And he would throw punches while leaning back. No one did that. And that worked for him. And it made him unique and fascinating, and he was also quick on his feet and moving, so it was remarkable to watch him in the ring. And then later on, when after he was stripped of the ability to fight during his prime, he incorporated other techniques. The rope-a-dope was one of them. People still know it fondly. If you go out somewhere and you talk about rope-a-dope, Rumble in the Jungle, Thriller in Manila, these are jargons and phrases that everyone would instantly associate with one man. And it was truly remarkable. The rope-a-dope worked as a technique but it was a sad technique. If you really look at it and study it, it was unfortunate that he had to incorporate that, but he did. If he didn't do that, his boxing career would have been over. And it's been estimated that Muhammad took over 200,000 punches in his career as a professional fighter, and the majority of them came in the later years in that rope-a-dope. The rope-a-dope, the bargain was, you can hit me as much as you want to, but you will wear yourself out, and then I'll take advantage of you. It was as a theory, it actually worked. But against strong fighters, he took an incredible pounding. And for every 100 punches that landed, he would land just a handful.
And he paid a toll for that later in his life, where his capacities were diminished. But after he stopped boxing, and before the very end of his life, he still had an active role in world affairs, which was also, I think, fascinating for an ex-athlete. And you do talk a little bit about it in your presentation, the work he did for the government and overseas, because he was such a known and revered and respected figure in many communities around the world, that he went as an emissary for the United States to try to, and successfully, bring back hostages in a variety of occasions.
And again, I mentioned earlier that Muhammad went from a period of being loved to being hated to being loved again. Now you're talking about that period where he was loved again. U.S. presidents called upon him to go overseas to try to get hostages released. You had Muhammad brought in as spokesperson for all these different groups, Native Americans, child advocacy groups. You had him you saw him advocating for religious acceptance and racial freedoms. This became part of who he was, and he continued to do that while he was still in good health. Eventually, Parkinson's left him in such a way that you didn't see him publicly anymore. But right up until then, he was out advocating for so many groups, the disabled, Special Olympics. He was a spokesman and a humanitarian. And that's what makes him unique and stand out in my mind, as much as his boxing career.
When we look back, as you have, what do you see as the essence of who Muhammad Ali is? But when you look at all the aspects, there seems to be there is a thread of an incredible amount of belief in oneself, whether it be physically, mentally, spiritually. There is that consistent thread that he had a great deal of confidence and belief in himself and who he was.
He did. Conviction is the word that I think I would use. And people who knew Muhammad Ali from the very early days, Joe Martin, his first coach when he was 12 years old, speaks about the dedication, the conviction to become the greatest. And those words by themselves, the greatest, are associated with Muhammad Ali. And all through his life, what he dedicated himself to, he threw himself in wholeheartedly, no matter what it was. He gave up his entire boxing career, the best known athlete on the planet, the prime of his life, for his religion. He was a proud black man, and he advocated the rights of black people at a time when blacks didn't have rights. He dared step out publicly and speak loudly on these issues. Even his position on segregation, which was different than most blacks at the time, he still championed that as a path forward for disenfranchised. He was someone who believed in himself wholeheartedly, threw himself behind his positions, and stayed the course. And eventually, we began to love him again. And he was someone who remains one of the greatest sports figures of our time.
Well, Andrew Brown, thank you so much for both your research on Muhammad Ali, but also for sharing it with us. A fascinating part of, I think, sports history, is a fascinating part of American history and legal history. And thank you for being with us on Miranda Warnings.
Thank you, David. I would simply end with float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. May you rest in peace, Muhammad Ali.
This has been Miranda Warnings, a New York State Bar Association podcast. You have the right to subscribe, rate, and review.